I'd also like to thank Bob and Themis for being here today and coming down and speak with us. It's a real treat for us here in Norwalk to have such distinguished leaders come and spend some time with us. It hasn't been a very difficult time, and knowing both of these leaders a little bit, I just would like to thank them personally for the time that they take away from their families and from their jobs to do what they do to the best of their ability to the state of Connecticut. And with that, I think we owe them a round of applause for that work. These questions have come from our members and come from, you'll think some of these are being reiterated from Peter's presentation, so bear with me. I want to provide some context to some of the questions, if that's okay. And this is from CBI's website. Connecticut lost 3,500 jobs in November, extending a 5-month slide that now marks to a crisis point for the state's struggling economy. The state has lost 15,300 jobs since reaching a post-recession employment high in June, a trend that stands in stark contrast to what's happening in the region and in the country. The New England states are averaging about 1.2% growth over the last 12 months, while the U.S. growth is at 1.4%. The State Department of Labor also reported that unemployment rate rose 0.1 point in November to 4.6%, the highest in the region and above the U.S. rate of 4.1%. Connecticut has recovered only 70% of all the jobs lost during the 2008 through 2010 recession, and is just one of a handful of states yet to reach the expansion point. Why has the state of Connecticut been lagging behind the region and nationally in job creation since the recession ended in 2010? And what would you suggest to change our existing trend? And what would you suggest to change our existing trend on a moving forward basis?
Well, you want to answer first?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Hello. Well, anyway, I think this is gonna. Thank you.
We'll turn them on.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Peter, for your report. And if people aren't familiar with Peter, that was his version of the happy dance. That was the best, most optimistic report I've heard him say in a long time. So it's great to be here, and I'm pleased to be here with my friend Themis and with Michael Devine as well. Clearly for us, jobs are still our top and only priority in the state of Connecticut. Expanding our job base, expanding growth here in the state of Connecticut is something that we have to continue to focus on. I think, if I were to answer, we could probably spend the rest of the time answering that question because there are a lot of very good points in there. Though I will say that, as Peter said, there's a lot of openings of positions that we have all over the place. We have many openings at Sikorsky and Pratt & Whitney and Electric Boat, advanced manufacturing jobs. We have a new economy here in the state of Connecticut. We need people who have advanced degrees and who are prepared and ready for the workforce. So the question is, what can we do as policymakers to help spur that and prepare students and prepare people for the workforce here in the state of Connecticut? Outside of some of the options and suggestions that Peter had, a number of things I think we need to do. One is make sure we have a budget that's balanced and we have controls on our spending and that we are paying down our pension debt and meeting our obligations. And I think we have worked really hard over the last 7 years to do that, finally paying our pension costs that are actuarially asked of us for the first time ever in the history of the state of Connecticut. But it really goes beyond that. For a long time, for about 30 or 40 years, I think, Connecticut went all in on our suburbs. We spent a lot of our policy, a lot of our money was in our suburbs, while we pretty much ignored a lot of our cities across the state. Nowadays, our young people, our millennials, want to live in the cities. They want to be in a place where they don't have to drive a car. They want to be in a place where there's good educational systems, there's good transportation, and there's good housing options. We didn't see that coming, I don't think, for a very long time. I'm not speaking of ourselves, I'm speaking of even past governors, past legislatures, kind of missed that coming along. So for us, I think it's important that we continue to make the investments we need to make in education, secondary education and higher education. By the way, about 80% or so of our in-state UConn grads stay in the state of Connecticut, and about 40% of our out-of-state UConn grads stay in the state of Connecticut. It's important that we do fix our transportation infrastructure issues. One of my top priorities as a guy here from Connecticut, from Fairfield County. And secondly, and third, is on housing. You have to have a diversity and a means of housing for people, and affordable housing is a part of that component. And affordable housing is an economic driver for us here in the state of Connecticut. So continuing on those paths that we have been focusing on over the last few years, I think is extremely important, but not losing sight of the fact that we've got to continue to pay down our pension debt that, by the way, was accumulated decades and decades and decades ago. And I always tell people I'm sorry that when I was in middle school and elementary school, I did not write my state legislator to ask them to pay down the pension debt, but we've got to now deal with it ourselves. So we've got to do those kinds of things, and that's unfortunately has been crowding out some of our other priorities that we have in the budget. I'm bullish on the state of Connecticut, and I think we still have a great state, and we have a lot of good things going for us. We've just got to make sure we put the pieces of the puzzle together for growth long term.
Thank you, Bob. I can't disagree with most of what Bob said. The problem with it is it kind of skips forward a lot of steps, and what I mean by that is this. He is correct insofar as saying that this is not a problem that just occurred this year. This is a problem that has been coming for many years, and there's certainly lots of blame to go around with different governors and different legislatures. Our problem right now is in the past 8 years, it's been made significantly worse by the two highest tax increases in the state's history, the highest bonding in the state's history, the most regulation in the state's history, and the list goes on and on. When we did a restructuring of that pension debt back in February, which was something I did not support and our Republican caucuses did not support, it was because it added $11 billion to the state's debt over the long term. And so that was not a fix that I thought was effective and financially prudent for the state of Connecticut. You probably followed a little bit, not as much as we did, of course, but because we were in it every day, the budget process from last year, it was a very painful one. Two budgets were passed. Only one was signed by the governor. One was passed in September. It was actually one of our proudest moments up there. It was a Republican budget that was passed with a handful of Democrat votes in the Senate and a handful in the House. It was something we were very proud of. It was a budget that moved Connecticut forward, but unfortunately the governor vetoed it, and the Democrat majority chose not to override that veto. At that point, and this is a point that I really need people to understand, we only had two choices. I mean, as much as we would like to be the person, I think, that makes the decision and says you're going to do this and this is what you're going to do, and nobody has any decision making besides us. We live in a democracy, we live in a republic, and we have separate but equal branches of government. The governor can do whatever he or she would like to do, and then the legislature decides if that's what they want to do too. Giving an example. Last week we came in as a legislature and we passed a bill that refunded the Medicare savings program in the state of Connecticut. That was done in a bipartisan manner. And it wasn't just done bipartisan, it was done in a way that will override a governor's veto, which he just came down with yesterday. That was something we were proud to do in a bipartisan way. The problem is, back in September, the governor was operating the state of Connecticut by executive order, which means if we do not have a budget by the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th last year, the governor is obligated by law to work month to month, basically, and do the things that are absolutely necessary to make the state of Connecticut work, which is what he did in July and in August and in September. I believe that the governor would have been very happy to do that for the rest of his term. Okay, that's his obligation, and he made that decision. Here's the problem with that. What he chose to do in those executive orders was zero out education funding for 88 towns, and to cut 55 other towns between 20 and 60%. So in our decision to sit down with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to figure out if we could come to a second bipartisan budget agreement, we had two choices: sit there and figure that out, or allow the governor to decimate the state of Connecticut more than he already has. And we came to an agreement on that, and that was something I think we were all proud of. But from our perspective, and certainly Bob can give his perspective being in that room, we were not going to come to an agreement unless we knew there were enough things in that budget that structurally changed the state of Connecticut, that did not stick gum in a hole, that did not push us forward 6 months or 8 months. We got spending caps, bonding caps, volatility caps. We got mandatory votes on union contracts. Guys, can you imagine that we as legislators, who you elect to go up there and do the job that's best for the state and your district, never voted on a union contract? I've been there 19 years. I have not voted on a union contract till this July. Because we weren't allowed to vote on one, not because I chose not to vote on one. None of us did. I mean, these are things that the state of Connecticut has been doing all these years. And there's hundreds of them. And we agreed on that budget, and we moved the state of Connecticut forward in regards to that. Right now, we have a almost $240 million deficit. 2 months later. That's something we're going to have to take up. That's what we're going to have to meet on to move the state of Connecticut forward. Our problem, guys, is not that I don't agree with what Bob said about the state of Connecticut. The problem is this state has been run and controlled by the state employee unions for way too many years.
I want to be respectful when I suggest this. In 60 seconds or less, I want to circle back to the question. Why has the state of Connecticut been lagging behind the region and nationally in job creation since the recession ended in 2010? And what would you suggest to change our existing trend? It's okay. Yeah, sure. Why has the state of Connecticut been lagging behind the region and nationally on job creation since the recession ended in 2010? And what would you suggest to change our existing trend?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that our economy changed after the recession. Think about where the UBS building and RBS building are right now. Those buildings, UBS building used to have about 4,000 employees in that building just a few years ago before the recession hit. That building, I think, has 2 people in now. Probably one's a maintenance person, probably the other person's a security person. And so they didn't leave because of any policy of the state of Connecticut. They left because of what happened to their own companies and internationally what happened to them. But that changed the financial services in the state of Connecticut. I'm assuming there was at least $100 million worth of income tax in that building that is no longer there right now, in that combined building across the street. Secondly is I don't think we competed for jobs for a long time. And now that we have companies are coming into the state of Connecticut, we had Henkel Corporation come in, they brought some employees from Arizona. We have Charter that's building a $500 million new building in downtown Stamford. We still have about 1,500 GE employees here located in Norwalk. We have HomeServe that's come up from Florida that's here as well. So I think those are the things that we've got to continue to do. The other thing about our job losses is that the biggest area in which we have lost jobs over the last few years has been in the government sector. Not been in the private sector, but in the government sector. So if you look at jobs that have been lost in the state and where that's going down, that has been in the government sector, which I would imagine would make some people in this room pretty happy. And certainly in the state of Connecticut, our state count for state employees is down significantly than it was over the last 7 or 8 years.
The reason our jobs have been lacking and not moving forward as quickly as everybody else is because we tax too much, we spend too much, we borrow too much. Businesses cannot afford to be in the state of Connecticut. Businesses cannot afford to be here. It's very simple, and I'm not some economist, and I even get it. Right? That is a common sense thing. We have year after year gotten these bills that say jobs at the top because we have the title, as if we can somehow create them. I'll tell you how you create them. You make a business environment that is healthy and encouraging to businesses. They come here, they make money, they hire more people, there are more jobs available, and more people go to work. Now, as far as manufacturing goes, we have all been very supportive of manufacturing jobs in this state, and we have put in several bills to encourage that, to the point that we're now working towards looking at grammar school, middle school students to encourage them to go in. But then what happens? I have a tech school in my district in Milford, and there's, I think, a 1,500 person wait list for kids who want to go to tech schools. and get that training and take those jobs. So that is something we have been focusing on and we will continue to focus on. But until we have a state that is a healthy business environment, we don't just not encourage people, we just push them out. I mean, the business we're gonna be in is the signs on those state borders that say get out. Because it's your words and your actions have to match. We can say we want you here, but if every single tax policy, borrowing policy that we have, if every single one says the opposite, that's what people are going to follow. Every time we get downgraded by a credit agency, it says the following things. We rely too much on a small tax base. Our borrowing is too high. Our taxing is too high. That's coming from the people who know. There's a reason for it. So saying one thing and doing another is not moving the state of Connecticut forward.
That's okay. I think I'm okay. Thank you. Thank you both for answering. Question number 2. Connecticut has lost 37,000 residents between 2015 and 2016, and they took more than $6 billion of income with them. But the most recent data from the Internal Revenue Service shows those leaving Connecticut are taking with them a lot of wealth with damaging consequences to the state's tax base. The Hartford Courant noted in a recent editorial that people moved out of Connecticut from 2015 to 2016 earned a little over $6 billion in adjusted gross income. People moving to Connecticut during that time arrived with about $3.3 billion in adjusted gross income, according to the IRS. That's a $2.7 billion hit to Connecticut's economy in that period. The IRS data shows that most Connecticut taxpayers moved to New York first and Florida second, with the average gross income for those leaving for New York with $111,000, but those who moved to Florida, it was over $253,000. As the Courant points out, that means more than $2 billion in income moved from Connecticut to Florida from 2015 to 2016. More than twice as much money has moved to New York. The question is this, and this is to Themis this time. What steps are you planning on taking to keep our residents and tax base here in Connecticut?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but until we have a state that businesses want to be in, that will create those jobs and create that environment, none of the rest will matter. Because the truth is, most people that have wealth, and the wealth we're talking about, are people who own their own businesses. That is just the reality of it. We, for the first time, I think 2 years ago, the Commissioner of Revenue Services in the state of Connecticut actually tracks, I don't know if it's weekly or monthly, the top 100 taxpayers in the state of Connecticut. Because we are in such a precarious situation now that if one person leaves, that completely throws off our tax revenue. One person. I mean, imagine a Commissioner of Revenue Services following that so closely. That has never happened before. I believe in my heart that that is what's going to move the state of Connecticut forward. But I have to tell you this. Back to me agreeing with what Bob said about everything he mentioned when he first answered. Our problem now, not our only problem, but a major problem we have, is our backs are against the wall in the legislature. So the governor and the legislature, this one, the one in the future, and going forward for a while. And the reason for that is we passed a bill back in July. It's called CBAC, the State Employees Bargaining Coalition, Bargaining Agents Coalition. That is the State Employees Union. Now, when Bob mentioned that we lost more state employees than we lost anything else, you know why? Because the state of Connecticut is the state of Connecticut's largest employer. Think about that. We are the largest employer in the state of Connecticut with approximately 45,000 state employees. When this bill was passed, which was something we did not support, we had alternatives to it. Our problem in Connecticut, there are only 4 states that collectively bargain pensions and health care. Some are a combination of the two, but generally speaking. Bob can't go to the state employees. I can't go to the state employees. The governor can't go to the state employees and say, we want to look at renegotiate your contract. They have to do it. They have to tell us they're willing to open it up. The governor was in negotiations all last year on that contract. He comes to the table. Now, mind you, that contract was up. Some of it was up now in 17, last year. Some of it was up in 2022. He came back with a deal that said the following: I will extend this contract to 2027. Time the hands of legislatures and governors for the next 10 years. There were guaranteed wage increases in that agreement. There were guaranteed no layoff provisions in that agreement. There are provisions that we pushed for that did not change, such as this. There are these things called state employee stewards. Meaning if you're a state employee and you work in a department in the state of Connecticut, you get paid to do your job, and then you get paid to do union work on the state taxpayer dime. We get what we call, well, we don't get it, but state employees get longevity payments. Basically saying, the longer you stay here, the more your raise will be, just because you stayed here. We have breakpoint payments. Also, the more money you make, the more money you will make, just because you make more money. These are just a handful of examples. I mean, I could talk about it all day long. That deal was voted on and passed. That has tied the hands of the state of Connecticut for the next 10 years. If any of you in your businesses were told you cannot touch over half of your budget, can't do anything about it, just take it, put it to the side, you cannot do anything about it, you got to figure out how to fix it with the other half, I don't think many people will be able to do that. That's the position we're in. So I have to say this. I don't know what to do about that. If it were me, I would get a lawyer in there and try and figure out how we reopen that contract. And it's not because I don't like state employees. I have many friends that are state employees. And it's not because I want to take more from state employees. But what I do know is this. We are on the verge of snapping off and falling into Long Island Sound. I know that Bob Duff is going to say somehow, it's not that bad. It's that bad. It is. I love Connecticut too. I've lived here my whole life. I want to stay here. But I'm sure all of you have said or hear every single day, I can't get out of here fast enough. As soon as my kid graduates, my husband retires, my wife retires, I'm moving. Every day. And it makes me sick because I have to try and use my persuasive abilities to convince them to stay till we can fix this. But it's scary. And it's because our hands are tied in a lot of ways because of that agreement. That agreement could have been renegotiated in a fairer way. Longevity payments, guys. Think about that. The more money you make, you'll make more money just because you made more money in the first place. Just because you stayed 10 years, there's a certain time. You know what? Well, now we'll give you a raise. Just because you're here. That's in addition to your state pension, your state health care, and the wages you already get. These things have to change. In this agreement, were there changes that were for the good? Yes. Nowhere near enough. And those are going to be the differences. Changing things like that will help us as legislators and the governor move the state of Connecticut forward because our hands are tied.
Thank you, Themis. Bob, I'll just kind of bring you back to the question here a little bit.
I remember the question.
Okay. What steps are you planning on taking over to keep our residents and tax base here in Connecticut?
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I love Themis. I
I
do love you. But it'll be a great moment when our leaders stop talking about how bad the state of Connecticut is. We are a great state. Do we have challenges? Absolutely. But we are a great state and we can meet those challenges and we can move forward. A few things. One, CBAC was a Republican idea back in the day. Two, yes it was, as a matter of fact.
What do you mean by that?
Secondly, is that in the Republican budgets that have been put forward over the years, and this is the first time Republicans voted for a budget in 10 or 11 years,
Not true.
is that they talk about the tax increases, but they took every penny of the tax increases and put it into their budget. So they didn't have budgets that said, we're going to wipe out any of those tax increases that we're hanging everybody else on, or we're going to do a big tax cut or anything else. They took every single penny of those tax increases and put it in their own budget. Three, is that if you look at my handy little chart here of the CBAC agreement, you can see right here where it goes down, because it was going the other direction before the agreement, was that costs were going up for the state for pension costs. Now they're going to be going down. And that has to do with, and again, I love you folks, that has to do with the kind of the adjustment that we made that, yes, does put extra costs on, but it was doing this for many years until about 2032 is going to have a $6 billion cliff that we're going to have to pay for, thanks to agreements that were made in the past by Republican governors and Democratic legislatures. And then, so we did this, and the CBAC agreement that has been made for the second time now in 7 years, there's been 2 different tiers, Tier 3, Tier 4. Tier 4 will save the state about $24 billion over the life of the agreement. And yes, so is there an extension of the agreement? Absolutely. But there's also lots of things that are good for the people of the state of Connecticut, meaning that there are higher co-pays and health insurance costs for state employees. There are costs that will be borne by the employees versus the employer. It brings down costs. It means that Tier 4 employees who are hired anytime after July 1st have a mix of a hybrid pension 401k. This has never been done before. So, and you have fewer state employees now than you did before. And again, I have another handy little chart on that as well. The number of state employees that we have. See the chart? Is going down. So we're asking fewer people to do more. So it's easy to rail against somebody you don't know or you don't see, but the facts speak a little differently. And so when we talk about what we did with the CBAC agreement and the agreements we've made with state employees, that's what was done. Now, some people are advocating either reopening this agreement or we should have just broken the contract in the first place. I guess that's okay to do, but you know what? We're paying for what John Rowland did back when I first got into the legislature, because he broke the contract, and we're paying today, millions and millions of dollars because of the illegal actions he took against that contract, and that was finally settled, and we have to budget for that money right now. So again, I think, are things perfect? No. Are we hopefully turning the curve? Yes. I am very happy that we have a bipartisan budget. We made a lot of structural changes that were priorities for Senate Democrats, the volatility cap being one, priorities that were of the Republican caucuses. I think that's great. I think we should be doing it. We've done things that we are showing other legislatures around the country and Washington that you can work in a bipartisan fashion. You don't grant everything, but you still can work in a bipartisan fashion. So we'll have our disagreements, but I always have to try and, at least from my vantage point, present the facts as I see them.
Okay. We didn't cover the 37,000 residents moving out of the state of Connecticut. I will ask a question. I will ask a question about the unfunded liabilities, even though you both answered it. But I would like to circle back to the question. We've lost 37,000 residents between 2015 and 2016, and just this question, please, in a minute or less. What steps are you planning to take to keep our residents and tax base in Connecticut?
Well, 37,000 people are leaving Connecticut and more are behind them for a simple reason. They can't afford to live here. They can't afford to live here. They can't get jobs here. It's just too expensive. I mean, there's a lot of details we could talk about, but Mike didn't tell us we had a minute or less the first time, so that was not our fault. And plus, it's 2 elected officials, so how could you expect that? That's what it is, guys. I mean, Bob is not wrong, and I said before that there were some good things in that negotiation. I don't disagree with that. And I also agree with the fact that the change in the pension restructuring, there were some good things in that. But guys, this isn't me being negative. Anybody who in here knows me, and for those who don't, I just tell you where we are. It is not my job to make it sound better. It is my job to tell you the good parts of it, and it is my job to tell you what the problems are and how we should fix them. And by fixing them, it is about making sure the structure of Connecticut changes. When that structure changes, and it is not too expensive for people to live here and work here, create jobs and get jobs, when our taxes are one of the highest in the country, property, income tax, etc., that's why people are leaving. They don't want to pay income tax here. Estate tax, inheritance tax, all of these things that in this budget we started moving and moving down the line, That is the vision for the state. And when that happens, those people will move back, or new people will move in.
Thank you.
Okay, let me answer that question as well. So the issue is that you've got people, we're an older state. You've got people who are retiring and they move out to Florida. It's not a new concept. Do we want them to do that? No. So in our bipartisan budget, we are addressing the gift tax, the estate tax, Social Security taxes, and trying to make sure that those are no longer taxable for folks who live here. We want our people to stay in the state of Connecticut. Now, some are still going to go because have you been outside versus what's the weather right now somewhere in Florida? It's probably pretty different. But we still want people to stay here if they can. The other part of this is to attract younger people. So why are we losing money between who's coming in and who's leaving? Well, because people are leaving because they're older and they have created their wealth and they're moving to another state. The people who are coming in are younger people who are just starting out and who are about to create their wealth. So it's really not that difficult to understand the reason why there's this and there's this. The other thing is that people move here because of our great quality of life. People move here because of our great schools. They move here because of our great environment that we have, quality of life. We have the best workforce in the nation. Most people who are most valuable employees. We have great Fortune 500 companies. We have a lot of good reasons to move here. Last I checked, people did not move to Florida because of the great schools, or of the lower crime rate, or the lower incidence of gun violence, or the great water quality that they have there, or lots of other things that make Connecticut a superior state. What I will say, though, one of our biggest challenges that we have, and I think Peter touched on it a little bit, was that we have 169 municipalities in this state. $5 billion goes towards our municipalities in the state. Now, here's an example of something that I brought up in our budget negotiations and got shot down, unfortunately. Well, everybody remember the hurricane that hit Houston, right? They have 4.5 million people in the Houston area. When they had the hurricane, people would call into the police dispatch center. They have one for 4.5 million people. We have 3.5 million people in the state. Anybody want to guess how many we have in Connecticut? 111. So do you think we could do things a little bit more efficiently and save money that way? But a lot of times people say, oh, no. We want everybody to cut all the taxes, but then when there's cuts made on the local level, people say you can't do that either. Well, it's either one or the other. So we've got to figure out ways in which we can have some additional efficiencies on the local level. I'm not saying county government, because everybody knows that's like the third rail, and that's not even allowed in our state constitution. But can we find additional ways to be more efficient? 50% of our school districts in this state have fewer than 3,000 students. Yet a lot of them have superintendents or administration or other means that keep them going. Can we do things a little bit more efficiently and so that people aren't spending so much money on property taxes? Yes, because when I hear people leaving the state of Connecticut, one of the reasons, their top reason for leaving generally, besides maybe warmer weather, is I can't afford my property taxes anymore. And so how can we as a state deal with that third rail issue in a way that doesn't scare people, that doesn't have people from different parties fighting at each other about who's trying to take away money or who's trying to take away local control, but do it in a smart way that actually makes our state more competitive, because we have 162 municipalities, 169 municipalities and 162 school districts, and again, 50% of our school districts have fewer than 3,000 students. I know there's a better way and a more efficient way to deal with those kinds of things.
Thank you. I know we've kind of gone over this a little bit, but I would at least ask the question here for our members. A report on government pensions says that Connecticut underestimated the state's pension liabilities by billions of dollars. The report, Hidden Debts, Hidden Deficits, How Pension Problems Are Consuming State and Local Budgets, from Stanford University's Hoover Institution, looks at government measures of pension costs and obligations and how these differ from market valuations. Joshua Routh, a senior fellow at Hoover, concludes that roughly $30 billion in pension liabilities that Connecticut officials reported in 2015 is actually $68.4 billion. The question is this: the train is running down the tracks and getting worse by the day. The governor, our next governor is going to inherit this issue as his or her own. How would each of you advise them on a path forward in solving the problem? Bob, this is to you.
Thanks. I mean, I think I've kind of mentioned it already. I mean, a lot of the work has been done from a standpoint of creating Tier 3, Tier 4 employees. And the reason why Tier 4 is important is because a lot of employees were going to retire before this last agreement was up. So it's important to have another agreement in place that actually saved additional money, which is why Tier 4 was created. And again, smoothing out that cliff was extremely important for us. So again, if you look at the chart, the costs are going to be going down on the retirement costs for us, but it's important not to get into the bad habits of the past, which is to not pay into the pensions the way we're supposed to. However, the other looming crisis, if you will, and Peter touched on this as well, is the teacher's retirement pension plan. That's doing this right now and going to have the $6 billion point sometime in the future. And again, these are costs, and by the way, teachers don't pay into Social Security in Connecticut. That was a deal made a long time ago, in the 30s or 40s, whenever it was. We can't change that, it's federal law. Teachers don't pay into Social Security. So, and in the past, people have not paid into pensions. So it's important that we smooth that out as well, because we cannot continue to have that carry out and drown out other things that we want to invest in, such as transportation, higher education, job training, and other types of things that we want, because those do send signals to the business community about are we serious about the future of the state of Connecticut. So the teacher's retirement is something we have got to deal with this legislative session coming up, so that when we do get a new governor, some of that stuff is done. But I would just argue, and I would say that as a leader myself, I will do everything possible to make sure that we do not get back into the bad habits of the past and skim along, not fully paying to the pensions, not have the discipline to make some of those tough decisions. I always kind of use this as a real estate analogy, is that I think the reason why the pension debt was never paid into fully in the past was obviously bad decision making and people wanting to do other things, but nobody likes to fix the furnace of their house. People would rather paint the house rather than fix the furnace. And fixing the furnace is kind of paying your debt. Nobody sees it, nobody knows where the money's going towards, but it actually makes you better and healthier. So we've got to kind of continue to fix the furnace and pay down those debts, and that way I think we can have long-term growth and we'll have a state that is sustainable.
Thank you.
Again, I don't agree with that conceptually. Problem comes in on how saying it and doing it are two different things. Let me first talk about, back in February, the governor did his State of the Budget address. He claimed in that budget they had no tax increases, which he didn't on the surface. But what he did was he was trying to shift the teacher's pension to the cities and towns. Now, I don't disagree with Bob. We have to do something to fix that, and that's a very serious conversation. That is not stuck into a budget and put a burden on those cities and towns without them having any notice and without that really being planned ahead. The worst part of it is, I hear my colleagues talk about how difficult and how burdensome property taxes are in Connecticut, which they are, and we hear that from everybody, from wealthier towns to middle-class towns to poorer towns. The problem is if we didn't push back, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle supported that transfer of the teachers' pension payments, partial, part of them, to the cities and towns, now in this budget. That's a problem. Because the governor said, my colleagues didn't say this, but the governor said, I will not support any tax increases. Well, if you put burdens, more financial burdens on cities and towns, how are your towns going to pay for that? They're going to increase your property taxes. That's what they're going to do. We went and met yesterday with the Council of Small Towns, and the governor just decided he is going to eliminate the second payment of Town Aid Road. Now that gets paid to towns twice a year, which means last year the towns got one payment, and they put all these projects into play. They are half a year into development, and now the state is going to cut off the rest of the pavement. I don't disagree. We have to figure out a better way to work with the teachers' retirement, because there is a problem. But just saying, here, you take the burden, now you take the burden, and then on the state level, we can say, look, we have less burden. That's not less burden, because whether you're paying state money out of this pocket or your town taxes out of that pocket, it's still coming from the same person. I mean, it's like we said we got a rate of return of 8%. We haven't gotten a rate of return of 8% on our investments, I don't know how long. Moved them down to 6.9% last year. We're still not even close to 6.9%. I apologize to anybody who thinks I'm being negative, but you cannot fix a problem unless you acknowledge what it is and figure out what the process is for that vision to move forward. One last comment. Before GE left, and I know there are lots of reasons GE was leaving, although they don't seem too happy in Boston at this point, and Boston doesn't seem too happy with them. But I had the opportunity to speak with the CFO, and we had a very good conversation before they left. But the one thing that stuck with me, that I cannot get out of my mind because it is as true can be, that was immediately after there was a state budget passed that had all sorts of unitary tax, loss carry forward, all sorts of very, very anti-business policies in it. He said, if you could snap your fingers and change that all back, like it didn't happen last month, it would not materially affect whether we stay or we go for this reason. We don't trust the vision of the leadership of the state of Connecticut. And that's the problem, guys. It's not fixing a problem for tomorrow or 6 months from now. It's, if we don't do it today because people start yelling and screaming, it's going to happen next year. It's going to happen 6 months from then. That's the problem. It's the vision of the state of Connecticut, and we've seen what has happened in the past 8 years.
Thank you. Let me just say, we've killed this thing, Bob. Like, we can't do pensions anymore, please. We gotta move it on. Gotta move it on. To a subject that's, I think, near and dear to a lot of people here and the residents of the state of Connecticut, transportation. Governor Malloy this week indefinitely postponed $4.3 billion in transportation projects, calling for the General Assembly to fix the state's troubled special transportation fund. Malloy's decision follows the release last month of a report showing the fund faces insolvency by 2020. Peter touched on that. They range from small maintenance updates to massive multi-million-dollar projects, including the widening of I-95 from Bridgeport to Stamford and overhauling Route 8. If Connecticut, this is a quote from the governor, if Connecticut does not take the necessary action to allow us to restart these vital projects, not only will it put the state's infrastructure into further state of disrepair, it will hurt our economy. It's preventable, he goes on to say, but requires an immediate action plan. The legislature must act this year to avoid potentially devastating setbacks to our transportation system. The governor said he will provide state lawmakers with detailed recommendations for restoring the transportation funding prior to the February 7th start of the 2018 General Assembly session. According to a Connecticut Mirror report, the governor would not reveal whether those recommendations would include tolls, gasoline tax hikes, or other revenue-raising measures. The question is this, and this goes to Themis, I believe. Bob, answer the first one?
I don't know who.
Whoever's, okay, that's fine.
I spoke last, so that's all.
Okay, that's fine. Bob, what are your thoughts on these project cuts? And do you anticipate a push for tolls or other tax increases to fund these projects on an ongoing basis?
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, these are long questions. So
I'm trying to provide
That's why
context.
they don't give us a lot of time. But
The answers are long,
anyway,
too.
Back on the pension for a second. No, okay. Transportation clearly is a major issue for us in the state of Connecticut. But I will say this, too, that the legislature has been extremely supportive of transportation over the years. We have taken a half percent of our sales tax and put that in transportation. There were some folks who wanted to have a bond cap on transportation. I disagreed with that. We have spent more money on transportation over the last 7 or 8 years than I think we have in the future. I think that there's probably right now a lot of projects on the list of things to do because there's been a lot of neglect, and you figure that projects are very, very costly. So for example, you have the Mixmaster in Waterbury, I think it's a $7 billion fix. You've got the Hartford Tunnel, which is $5 billion. You've got how many countless projects here in Fairfield County that are cost a lot of money to get done too. These have all got to get done at some point, and we have to have these conversations. And you know, I have another chart, sorry. But we have put a lot of money into the transportation fund from the general fund, and you can see right here, this one's actually in color, that we have put a lot of money from our petroleum tax into our general fund, and actually more than was even anticipated to go in back in 2005 when we increased that. So I have suggested that we do a transportation authority like they have in other states that then will make decisions that are best for our transportation infrastructure. The legislature clearly has not had the ability to make some of the tough decisions about how to fund all of our transportation needs, especially because of the fact that so many have been neglected for so long. And nobody wants to drive on a road that is crumbling. Nobody wants to go on a bridge that is in disrepair. And we have to make those decisions for ourselves here in the state of Connecticut. One just quick comment on the federal tax bill. That I wish we're gonna, you know, was it $1.5 trillion in debt more based on this tax bill? I wish the federal government would have said, you know what? Why don't we put a little of that money towards transportation nationally? Because if anybody has traveled anywhere around the world, especially in Asia right now, they're kicking our butts on transportation. So whether it's in trains, buses, roadways, airports, I mean, our airports are awful compared to the airports around the world. And yet we're just sitting around going after continuing resolution in Washington without any kind of a vision on some of the major issues that affect us here in this nation. And that trickles down to us here in the state of Connecticut. So we've got to have some sort of a decision-making body. It's fine if it's the legislature, but the legislature's not been able to do some of the heavy lifting on this. But somebody's going to have to make some of those decisions on what we do with transportation and how we're going to pay for all of it.
Again, this comes back to what our resources are. The governor last year, I believe, put out a plan that how many $100 billion, trillion dollars of gazillion dollars that we should invest in transportation. I'd be the first one to sign up for that if we had $100 billion gazillion dollars. We don't have $100 billion gazillion cents, guys, okay? So here's the problem. We have to figure out what our money is and what we believe our core functions of government are and who we need to prioritize. That's why we went into session last week and fixed the Medicare savings plan now instead of a month from now when the governor wanted to, because we believe that low-income seniors who need help with their prescriptions should get them. Okay, that's a priority, in my opinion. As far as transportation, we all agree transportation is a priority. We don't have that gazillion dollars. So we came out with a plan that had over $60 billion in bonding over 30 years to start working on our transportation. We don't agree that the governor stopped those bonding projects, but we don't have the money. So we have to figure out what's the first place we go with transportation? Safety. All the bridges and roads that actually are safety problems. That's what we have to focus on first before we do anything else. As much as we need to expand roads and do all these fancy things, it's safety first. We have to focus on that. That was our plan for the past 2 years that we didn't get agreement on in the entire legislature and through the governor. But that's what we have to do. We have to figure out what our core functions of government, who needs our help the most vulnerable, safety, etc. And that's where we have to move down that road. I mean, I hear from my colleagues that we bond too much, yet it was like pulling teeth to try and get a bonding cap, right? So you can't speak out both sides of your mouth. You either want a bonding cap or you don't. You can't say we bond too much, then don't support the cap. I mean, we had a cap this year, but it wasn't a strong cap. I sat on a panel last year. The state treasurer had a panel. I know Jamie was there because she was sitting in the same spot she is now to me, so I remember seeing her. The Speaker of the House was with me, and the Governor's Budget Director, Ben Barnes. And at one point, he said the following words: part of our problem is we bond too much. And I I looked at him, I said, Ben, I couldn't agree with you more, but under the past 8 years of your boss's reign, we have borrowed more than we ever have in the history of the state of Connecticut. Which is a factual statement, I mean, right, that's just a number, it's not my opinion, it's a number. So that's not true. I go, of course it's true. He goes, no, it's not. He goes, I'd like to see the numbers. I go, you gave them to us. They're your numbers. So guys, I just caution you, pay very close attention to what people are saying versus what they're doing, because don't tell me from his perspective that we haven't bonded the most we've ever bonded in the history of the state, and then tell me we didn't. I mean, I swear people have Stockholm syndrome of themselves at this point. It is what it is, whether it's good or it's bad. Here are the facts, and here's how we fix them.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. We're kind of coming up against it here. I want to thank you both very much for taking your time out and share your thoughts. It's a difficult time. And on behalf of the Chamber, I think one of the things that our Government Affairs Committee has taken away, even though it was a very long budget session, it was great to see the Republican and the Democratic parties come together and to pass a budget together. And we hope that that spirit of bipartisanship continues as you face some very difficult decisions ahead. So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Webster Bank.